Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of The Reading Corner with MooseChangerPat. That's me, in case you're wondering. Today we are reading Chapter 14 of Queen of Sorcery by David Eddings, and as always, you should support the original work by buying the original book. Chapter 14. The house of Count Dravor was a large white building set in the center of a broad lawn with clipped hedges and formal gardens on either side. The moon, fully overhead now, illuminated every detail as they rode slowly up a white gravelled, curving road that led to the house. The soldiers ordered them to dismount in the courtyard between the house and the garden on the west side of the house, and they were hustled inside and down a long hallway to a heavy polished door. Count Dravor was a thin, vague-looking man with deep pouches under his eyes, and he sprawled in a chair in the center of a richly furnished room. He looked up with a pleasant, almost dreamy smile on his face as they entered. His mantle was a pale rose color with silver trim at the hem and around the sleeves to indicate his rank. It was badly wrinkled and none too clean. "And who are these guests?" he asked, his voice slurred and barely audible.
"The prisoners, my lord," the three-fingered soldier explained. "The ones you ordered arrested."
"Did I order someone arrested?" the Count asked, his voice still slurred. "What a remarkable thing for me to do. I hope I haven't inconvenienced you, my friends."
"We were a bit surprised, that's all," Silk said carefully.
"I wonder why I did that," the Count pondered. "I must have had a reason. I never do anything without a reason. What have you done wrong?"
"We haven't done anything wrong, my lord," Silk assured him.
"Then why would I have you arrested? There must be some mistake."
"That's what we thought, my lord," Silk said.
"Well, I'm glad that's all cleared up," the Count said happily. "May I offer you some dinner, perhaps?"
"We've eaten, my lord."
"Oh." The Count's face fell with disappointment. "I have so few visitors."
"Perhaps your steward Wydus might remember the reason these people were detained, my lord,"
the three-fingered soldier suggested. "Of course," the Count said. "Why didn't I think of that? Wydus remembers everything. Please send for him at once."
"Yes, my lord."
The soldier bowed and jerked his head curtly at one of his men. Count Dravor dreamily began playing with one of the folds of his mantle, humming tunelessly as they waited. After a few moments, a door at the end of the room opened, and a man in an iridescent and intricately embroidered robe entered. His face was grossly sensual, and his head was shaved.
"You sent for me, my lord?"
His rasping voice was almost a hiss. "Ah, Wydus," Count Dravor said happily. "How good of you to join us."
"It's my pleasure to serve you, my lord,"
the steward said with a sinuous bow. "I was wondering why I asked these friends to stop by," the Count said. "I seem to have forgotten. Do you by any chance recall?"
"It's just a small matter, my lord," Wydus answered. "I can easily handle it for you. You need your rest. You mustn't overexert yourself, you know."
The Count passed a hand across his face. "Now that you mention it, I do feel a bit fatigued, Wydus. Perhaps you could entertain our guests while I rest a bit."
"Of course, my lord,"
Wydus said with another bow. The Count shifted around in his chair and almost immediately fell asleep.
"The Count is in delicate health," Wydus said with an oily smile. "He seldom leaves that chair these days. Let's move away a bit so that we don't disturb him."
"I'm only a Drasnian merchant, your eminence," Silk said, "and these are my servants, except for my sister there. We're baffled by all of this."
Wydus laughed. "Why do you persist in this absurd fiction, Prince Keldar? I know who you are. I know you all, and I know your mission."
"What's your interest in us, Niacin?" Mr. Wolf asked bluntly.
"I serve my mistress, Eternal Salmisra," Wydus said.
"Has the snake woman become the pawn of Grollem's, then?" Aunt Paul asked, "or does she bow to the will of Zadar?"
My queen bows to no man, Polgara, Widus denied scornfully. Really? She raised one eyebrow. It's curious to find her servant dancing to a Grolum tune, then. I have no dealings with Grolums, Widus said. They're scouring all Talnidra for you, but I'm the one who found you. Finding isn't keeping, Yidis, Mr. Wolf stated quietly. Perhaps you could tell us what this is all about. I'll tell you only what I feel like telling you, Belgrath. I think that's about enough, Father, Aunt Paul said. We really don't have time for Nyasan riddle games, do we? Don't do it, Porgera, Widus warned. I know all about your power. My soldiers will kill your friends if you so much as raise your hand. Garion felt himself roughly grabbed from behind, and a sword blade was pressed firmly against his throat. Aunt Paul's eyes blazed suddenly. You're walking on dangerous ground. I don't think we need to exchange threats, Mr. Wolf said. I gather then that you don't intend to turn us over to the Grolums. I'm not interested in the Grolums, Widus said. My queen has instructed me to deliver you to her in Sathistor. What's Salmisra's interest in this matter? Wolf asked. It doesn't concern her. I'll let her explain that to you when you get to Sathistor. In the meantime, there are a few things I'll require you to tell me. I think thou wilt have scant success in that, Mandaralin said stiffly. It is not our practice to discuss private matters with unwholesome strangers. And I think you're wrong, dear Baron, Widus replied with a cold smile. The cellars of this house are deep, and what happens there can be most unpleasant. I have servants highly skilled in applying certain exquisitely persuasive torments. I do not fear thy torments, Nyasan, Mandaralin said contemptuously. No, I don't imagine you do. Fear requires imagination, and you errands aren't bright enough to be imaginative. The torments, however, will wear down your will, and provide entertainment for my servants. Good torturers are hard to find, and they grow sullen if they aren't allowed to practice. I'm sure you understand. Later, after you've all had the chance to visit with them a time or two, we'll try something else. Nyissa abounds with roots and leaves and curious little berries with strange properties. Oddly enough, most men prefer the rack or the wheel to my little concoctions. Widus laughed again, a brutal sound with no mirth in it. We'll discuss all this further after I have the Count settled in for the night. For now, the guards will take you downstairs to places I prepared for you all. Count Dravor roused himself and looked around dreamily. Are our friends departing so soon? He asked. Yes, my lord, Widus told him. Well then, the Count said with a vague smile, farewell, dear people. I hope you'll return some day so that we can continue our delightful conversation. The cell to which Garion was taken was dank and clammy, and it smelled of sewage and rotting food. Worst of all was the darkness. He huddled beside the iron door with the blackness pressing in on him palpably. From one corner of the cell came little scratchings and skittering sounds. He thought of rats and tried to stay as near to the door as possible. Water trickled somewhere, and his throat began to burn with thirst. It was dark, but it was not silent. Chains clinked in a nearby cell, and someone was moaning. Further off there was insane laughter, a meaningless cackle repeated over and over again without pause, endlessly rattling in the dark. Someone screamed, a piercing, shocking sound, and then again. Garion cringed back against the slimy stones of the wall, his imagination immediately manufacturing tortures to account for the agony in those screams. Time in such a place was non-existent, and so there was no way to know how long he had huddled in his cell, alone and afraid, before he began to hear a faint metallic scraping and clicking that seemed to come from the door itself. He scrambled away, stumbling across the uneven floor of his cell to the far wall. "Go away!" he cried. Keep your voice down, Silk whispered from the far side of the door. Is that you, Silk? Garen almost sobbed with relief. Who were you expecting? How did you get loose? Don't talk so much, Silk said from between clenched teeth. Accursed rust! He swore. Then he grunted, and there was a grating click from the door. There! The cell door creaked open, and the dim light from torches somewhere filtered in. Come along, Silk whispered. We have to hurry. Garion almost ran from the cell. Aunt Paul was waiting a few steps down the gloomy stone corridor. Without a word, Garion went to her. She looked at him gravely for a moment, and then put her arms about him. They did not speak. Silk was working on another door, his face gleaming with perspiration. The lock clicked, and the door creaked open. Hedar stepped out. What took you so long? He asked Silk. Rust! Silk snapped in a low voice. I'd like to flog all the jailers in this place for letting the locks get into this condition. Do you suppose we could hurry a bit? Barrack suggested over his shoulder from where he stood guard. Do you want to do this? Silk demanded. Just move along as quickly as you can, Aunt Paul said. We don't have the time for bickering just now. She primly folded her blue cloak over one arm. Silk grunted sourly and moved on to the next door. Is all this oratory actually necessary? Mr. Wolf, the last to be released, asked crisply as he stepped out of his cell. You've all been babbling like a flock of geese out here. Prince Keldar felt the need to make observations about the conditions of the locks, Mandaralin said lightly. Silk scowled at him and led the way toward the end of the corridor where the torches fumed greasy onto the blackening ceiling. Have a care, Mandaralin whispered urgently. There's a guard. A bearded man in a dirty leather jerkin sat on the floor with his back against the wall of the corridor, snoring. Can we get past without waking him up? Durnick breathed. He isn't going to wake up for several hours, Barrack said grimly. The large purple swelling on the side of the guard's face immediately explained. Dost thou think there might be others? Mandaralin asked, flexing his hands. There were a few, Barrack said. They're sleeping too. Let's get out of here, then, Wolf suggested. We'll take Wydis with us, won't we? Aunt Paul asked. What for? I'd like to talk with him, she said, at great length. It would be a waste of time, Wolf said. Salmistra's involved herself in this affair. That's all we really need to know. Her motives don't really interest me all that much. Let's just get out of here as quietly as we can. They crept past the snoring guard, turned a corner, and moved softly down another corridor. Did he die? A voice shockingly loud asked from behind a barred door and emitted a smoky red light. No, another voice said, only fainted. You pulled too hard on the lever. You have to keep the pressure steady, otherwise they faint and you have to start over. This is a lot harder than I thought, the first voice complained. You're doing fine, the second voice said. The rack's always tricky. Just remember to keep a steady pressure and not to jerk the lever. They usually die if you pull their arms out of the sockets. Aunt Paul's face went rigid, and her eyes blazed briefly. She made a small gesture and whispered something. A brief hush sound murmured in Garion's mind. You know, the first voice said rather faintly, suddenly I don't feel so good. Now that you mention it, I don't either, the second voice agreed. Did that meat we have for supper taste all right to you? It seemed all right. There was a long pause. I really don't feel so good at all. They tiptoed past the barred door, and Garion carefully avoided looking in. At the end of the corridor was a stout oak door bound with iron. Silk ran his fingers around the handle. It's locked from the outside, he said. Someone's coming, Hedar warned. There was the tramp of heavy feet on the stone stairs behind the door, the murmur of voices, and a harsh laugh. Wolf turned quickly to the door of a nearby cell. He touched his fingers to the rusty iron lock, and it clicked smoothly. In here, he whispered. They all crowded into the cell, and Wolf pulled the door shut behind them. When we've got some leisure, I'll want to talk to you about that, Silk said. You were having such a good time with the locks that I didn't want to interfere, Wolf smiled blandly. Now listen, we're going to have to deal with these men before they find out that our cells are empty and rouse the whole house.
We could do that,
Beric said confidently. They waited. They're opening the door, Dernick whispered. How many are there? Mandaralin asked. I can't tell. 8, Aunt Paul said firmly.
All right, Beric decided. We'll let them pass and then jump on them from behind. A scream or two won't matter much in a place like this. But let's put them down quickly.
They waited tensely in the darkness of the cell. Whitus says it doesn't matter if some of them die under the questioning, one of the men outside said. The only ones we have to keep alive are the old man, the woman, and the boy. Let's kill the big one with the red whiskers, then, another suggested. He looks like he might be troublesome, and he's probably too stupid to know anything useful.
I want that one, Beric whispered.
The men in the corridor passed their cell.
Let's go,
Beric said. It was a short, ugly fight. They swarmed over the startled jailers in a savage rush. 3 were down before the others fully realized what was happening. One made a startled outcry, dodged past the first, and ran back toward the stairs. Without thinking, Garion dove in front of the running man. Then he rolled, tangled the man's feet, tripping him up. The guard fell, started to rise, then sagged back down in a limp heap as Silk neatly kicked him just below the ear. Are you all right? Silk asked. Garion squirmed out from under the unconscious jailer and scrambled to his feet. But the fight was nearly over. Dernick was pounding a stout man's head against the wall, and Beric was driving his fist into another's face. Mandaralin was strangling a third, and Hedar stalked the fourth, his hands out. The wide-eyed man cried out once, just as Hedar's hands closed on him. The tall Algar straightened, spun about, and slammed the man into the stone wall with terrific force. There was the grating sound of bones breaking, and the man went limp.
Nice little fight,
Beric said, rubbing his knuckles. Entertaining, Hedar agreed, letting the limp body slide to the floor. Are you about through? Silk demanded hoarsely from the door by the stairs.
Almost, Beric said. Need any help, Dernick?
Dernick lifted the stout man's chin and examined the vacant eyes critically. Then he prudently banged the jailer's head against the wall once more and let him fall. Shall we go? Hedar suggested.
Might as well,
Beric agreed, surveying the littered corridor. The door is unlocked at the top of the stairs, Silk said as they joined him, and the hallway is empty beyond it. The house seems to be asleep, but let's be quiet. They followed him silently up the stairs. He paused briefly at the door. Wait here a moment, he whispered. Then he disappeared, his feet making absolutely no sound. After what seemed a long time, he returned with weapons the soldiers had taken from them. I thought we might need these. Garion felt much better after he had belted on his sword. Let's go, Silk said, and led them to the end of the hall and around a corner. I think I'd like some of the green, Whitus. Count Dravor's voice came from behind a partially open door. Certainly, my lord, Whitus said in his sibilant, rasping voice. The green tastes bad, Count Dravor said drowsily, but it gives me such lovely dreams. The red tastes better, but the dreams aren't so nice. Soon you'll be ready for the blue, my lord, Whitus promised. There was a faint click and the sound of liquid being poured into a glass. Then the yellow, and finally the black. The black's best of all. Silk led them on tiptoe past the half-open door. The lock on the outside door yielded quickly to his skill, and they all slipped out into the cool moonlit night. The stars twinkled overhead, and the air was sweet. I'll get the horses, Hedar said. Go with him, Mandaralin, Wolf said. We'll wait over here. He pointed out the shadowy garden. The 2 men disappeared around the corner, and the rest of them followed Mr. Wolf into the looming shadow of the hedge which surrounded Count Dravor's garden. They waited. The night was chilly, and Garion found himself shivering. Then there was a click of a hoof touching a stone, and Hedar and Mandaralin came back, leading the horses. We'd better hurry, Wolf said. As soon as Dravor drops off to sleep, Whitus is going to go down to his dungeon and find out that we've left. Lead the horses. Let's get away from the house before we start making any noise. They went down the moonlit garden with the horses trailing after them until they emerged on the open lawn beyond. They mounted carefully. We'd better hurry, Aunt Paul suggested, glancing back at the house. I bought us a little time before I left, Silk said with a short laugh. How do you manage that? Barrack asked. When I went to get our weapons, I also set fire to the kitchen, Silk smirked. That will keep their attention for a bit. A tendril of smoke rose from the back of the house. Very clever, Aunt Paul said with a certain grudging admiration. Why, thank you, my lady. Silk made a mocking little bow. Mr. Wolf chuckled and led them away at an easy trot. The tendrils of smoke at the back of the house became thicker as they rode away, rising black and oily toward the uncaring stars.